When you hear the word Indian, your mind jumps to feathers, tippis, and Hollywood's red-painted extras. But you don't picture dark skin, tight curls, wide noses. You don't picture people who look like us. That's not by accident. That's by design. America wrote the script so you'd see Native and African as separate. Never as kin, never as one. But the lie cracks quick if you look at the evidence. Carvings of dark-skinned figures in ancient America. The giant Olmec heads with African features. Carved centuries before Columbus, and journals from early Europeans describing Negro Indians they met face to face. Before Columbus, before the slave ships, there were already black people on this land. And after slavery began, the story only got stronger. Because every person who broke free from chains had a choice: hide alone or find community. And many found refuge with native nations. They married, raised families, mixed cultures, built towns. From those unions came the people we call Black Indians, living proof that America's racial lines were never clean, never simple, never what they told you. The U.S. government knew. That's why they invented systems like the Dawes Rolls. In the 1800s, designed to cut dark-skinned families out of native identity. If your hair curled too tight, if your skin was too brown, you got listed as freedman, not Indian. That one word stripped your descendants of land rights and history, a paper genocide. Yet despite the ink, the bloodlines never disappeared. Families today still carry the features, the stories, the memory dot, and if you want to see where this hidden nation stood tallest, you have to look south. Because down in the swamps of Florida, something was happening that scared America to death. Escaped Africans were linking up with Seminole tribes, building settlements the U.S. Army could barely touch. These weren't runaway slaves hiding in shadows. These were warriors, armed and organized, ready to fight. They called them the Black Seminoles. And trust me, their legend is nothing short of terrifying for the powers that be. Picture it. Swamplands. Stretching for miles, Spanish moss hanging heavy, humid air wrapping around you like a cloak. Into that landscape stepped men and women who had every reason to fight. Africans fleeing the plantations, Seminoles resisting removal, both groups. Hunted by soldiers and slave catchers. Instead of scattering, they came together. They built fortified villages, planted crops, trained fighters. They knew the swamps like the back of their hands. How to vanish into the water. How to strike without warning. How to make an army. Twice their size feel powerless. The U.S. called them Maroons, and for decades they were a thorn in America's side. Soldiers sent south often didn't return. Slaveholders feared their power because every escapee that slipped away might end up joining this alliance, turning weakness into strength. What's worse for the government? These people weren't begging for freedom. They were taking it, gun in hand, on their own terms. Wars broke out. You've heard of the Seminole Wars? The longest, costliest Indian wars in U.S. history. What textbooks don't tell you is that black warriors were at the heart of them. They fought side by side with native allies, pushing back against Andrew Jackson's army, resisting forced removal, refusing to bow. Black Seminoles were scouts, leaders, strategists. They knew how to track soldiers, how to use terrain as a weapon. And the U.S. Army, with all its resources, struggled to defeat them. Here's something they never teach you in school. When General Jessup finally faced the truth, he admitted the war wasn't just against Seminoles. He called it, in his own words, a Negro War. Imagine that. America's general, stripped of pride, forced to admit that the people they enslaved were now the backbone of a military resistance that the government couldn't crush. But America doesn't like stories of black resistance. So instead of putting black Seminoles on a pedestal, history buried them. Still, the fear of black Indians shaped everything. When the U.S. finally forced Seminoles west on the Trail of Tears, many black families went with them, bound by loyalty and marriage. Others escaped south to Mexico, where they found refuge and freedom in border towns. Think about that. An army of ex-slaves and natives carving out space for themselves across multiple countries, refusing to vanish. And their story doesn't end there. Descendants of black Seminoles still live in Oklahoma, Texas, and northern Mexico. They carry surnames passed down from warriors who fought U.S. soldiers to a standstill. They still fight for recognition today, demanding that tribes acknowledge their place not as outsiders, but as blood. This isn't French history. This is the part of America they keep under lock and key. Because if you admit that black and native people stood together, fought together, won together, it shatters the myth that slavery made us powerless and that natives were simply victims. It shows we were nation builders, warriors, revolutionaries, and the Seminoles were just one chapter. Look at the Cherokee. Look at the Creeks. You'll find the same mixing, the same alliances, the same buried stories. The Cherokee, in particular, carry one of the most tangled, painful, and important pieces of this history. They enslaved Africans, yes, but they also intermarried, adopted, and produced generations of black Cherokee families. Families that the U.S. government tried to erase with the stroke of a pen, the same way they erased the Seminole freedmen. But bloodlines don't disappear, and memory doesn't die. And when you follow that trail into the Cherokee story, you see how black and Indian were never neat categories, never separate boxes. You see how America twisted laws, treaties, and tribal politics to divide people who had already chosen to live as one dot. So if you really want to know why America hid the black Indians, the answer is simple: because unity is dangerous. Unity means resistance. Unity means survival. And unity between Africans and natives was a fire that the U.S. government spent centuries trying to stamp out. But no matter how hard they tried, the smoke still rises. The Cherokee story is where things get messy, and that's why it matters. Because if the Seminoles showed us what black Indians could build together in freedom, the Cherokee show us what happens when America steps in and twists the knife, forcing divisions that never had to exist. See, the Cherokee Nation was considered one of the 5 civilized tribes. That's the label white America slapped on them. Why? Because the Cherokee, like the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, adopted parts of European culture, written language, schools, farming, even slaveholding. That last part is where the story takes a dark turn. Yes, the Cherokee enslaved Africans. By the early 1800s, thousands of black men, women, and children were held as property inside the Cherokee Nation. And yet, it wasn't as simple as a plantation copy-paste. Cherokee slavery was shaped by native culture, and many enslaved Africans lived close, ate together, spoke the language, and were absorbed into daily Cherokee life. That proximity blurred lines, created bonds, and led to intermarriage, which meant that despite the chains, bloodlines were still mixing, families still forming, and the black Indian identity kept growing. But America? America doesn't like blurred lines. The U.S. needed races to stay in their boxes. So when the Cherokee were forced on the Trail of Tears, that brutal death march west, thousands of black people walked it too. Some as slaves, some as freedmen, some as family. Think about that. Africans and natives walking side by side, starving, freezing, dying on the same road. And when they finally reached Indian territory, what we call Oklahoma today, they rebuilt. Together. That's the piece America always hides. They want you to see the Cherokee only as victims, Africans only as property. But the truth is, those two stories overlapped, tangled together, until you couldn't separate them. Black people became Cherokee. Cherokee became black. And when the Civil War came, that mix exploded into a fight over identity that still hasn't ended. During the war, parts of the Cherokee Nation sided with the Confederacy. They fought for slavery to continue. Other parts sided with the Union. Black Cherokees fought on both sides, often as the deciding factor in battle. After the war, treaties forced the Cherokee Nation to free all its slaves and adopt them as citizens. On paper, that meant equality. In reality, it was war inside the tribe. Some Cherokee leaders tried to strip black members of land, rights, and recognition, just like the Dawes Rolls later would. And here we are in 2025, with freedmen descendants, still fighting for full tribal membership. Proof that America's racial line drawing never stopped. Now the Creeks. Their story runs parallel, and it's just as explosive. The Creek Nation, or Muskogee, was another one of those so-called civilized tribes. They too owned African slaves, but like the Cherokee, the line between slave and family wasn't always clear. Many Africans lived within Creek towns, intermarried, adopted the language, and fought alongside Creeks in wars. Over time, whole communities of Creek freedmen emerged, recognized as part of the nation. And when pressure from the U.S. grew, the Creeks and their black allies resisted together. Some of the fiercest Creek warriors were of African descent. They joined in uprisings, burned plantations, and terrified white settlers who thought they were safe. The combination of Creek strategy and African determination created a resistance America struggled to crush, but once again, the government found its weapon: paper, treaties, rolls, signatures. Divide the people, slice their identity apart with laws, and call it civilization. The Dawes Commission came knocking in the late 1800s, and suddenly, black Creeks were labeled freedmen, separate from real Creeks, even though their bloodlines were tangled beyond separation. It was another erasure, stamped and filed. In Washington's cabinets, here's the mystery America doesn't want you to ask. If black bloodlines were so deeply woven into Cherokee and Creek nations, how many of the pure native families today are carrying African DNA without even knowing? How many tribal leaders, how many politicians, how many so-called historians are standing on a platform built by mixed ancestors, while denying the people who share that same heritage? That's the heart of the Black Indian story: contradiction. You've got tribes who enslaved Africans, yet also became family with them. You've got Africans who suffered inside native nations, yet also rose to leadership within them. You've got governments that swore to recognize freedmen as equals, then turned around and erased them. It's messy. You're taught, because when you admit that Cherokee and Creek nations were full of black families, when you admit the bloodlines were already blended, suddenly the whole racial map of America starts to blur. Who's black? Who's native? Who's both? And if both, why did the system spend centuries trying to make them pick one side? That's the question America never answers. And just like with the Seminoles, when you dig into Cherokee and Creek history, you don't just find oppression, you find rebellion. Black Creeks and Black Cherokees weren't passive. They joined. Rebellions led escapes, fought soldiers, and carved out free settlements when the system tried to crush them. Some ran south and joined Seminoles. Others built towns in Indian territory that thrived for decades before jealous white mobs burned them down. Every time these people found a way to breathe, America came with fire to choke it out. But here's the truth they can't erase: those families survived. Their bloodlines live on. Their descendants walk the streets of Oklahoma, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and beyond. Some call themselves black, some call themselves native. Many carry both, whether they admit it or not. That's the power of the Black Indian story. It refuses to die, no matter how many times the system tries to bury it. And if you think this was just about the Cherokee and the Creeks, wait until you see what happened when these blended nations started building their own wealth, their own towns, their own power bases. That's when America really panicked. Because a free, united, wealthy Black Indian community, that was the one thing they couldn't afford to let exist. Asterisk asterisk, once the Cherokee, Creeks, and Seminoles were forced west into Indian territory, a strange thing happened. For a moment, Black people tasted freedom on native land in ways the United States had never intended. Freedmen, once enslaved inside tribes, were suddenly citizens by treaty. They were promised land, rights, the ability to build. And for a brief window, Black Indians and freedmen families rose. Picture this: Oklahoma, late 1800s, fertile land stretching wide, carved up into allotments. Families of African and native descent planting crops, building homes, starting schools. They weren't waiting on America to save them. They were carving their own future, and it worked. Black Indians became landowners, entrepreneurs, farmers, even politicians. They blended native traditions with African resilience and created communities where wealth actually stayed in Black hands. And that right there, that's the nightmare America couldn't stomach, that. Because every time Black people got a taste of prosperity, this country found a way to burn it down. And in Indian Territory, it was no different. The freedmen of the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. Nations built whole towns that thrived. All Black towns like Boley, Clearview, Rentisville, and Taft stood as proof that the descendants of slaves and natives could build wealth, stability, and independence on their own terms. You've heard of Tulsa's Greenwood District, Black Wall Street. What you might not know is that many of those families had roots in Black Indian bloodlines. Freedmen who had been promised land in Indian Territory built the foundation of Greenwood. And when Greenwood exploded with success, theaters, banks, law offices, even an airstrip, white Oklahoma lost its mind. Planes dropped fire from the sky. White mobs stormed the streets. On a living, burning, looting. Tulsa wasn't a riot. It was a massacre. And underneath that massacre was the story of Black Indians, freedmen descendants whose wealth made them a target. America didn't just erase them from tribal roles. It tried to erase them from the earth. And Tulsa wasn't alone. Rosewood, in Florida, Wilmington in North Carolina, Seneca Village in New York, time and again, when Black people, especially those with native roots, created thriving communities, the system struck back with bombs, mobs, or bulldozers. They called it progress. They called it urban renewal. But let's call it what it was: a campaign of erasure. Think about the pattern. First they erased Black Indians on paper with the Dawes Rolls. Then, when those same families turned paper, scraps into towns and wealth, they erased them again with fire. 2 genocides, one legal, one physical, and both designed to keep Black and native descendants in check. But here's the twist they couldn't predict. Every time they burned us down, we rebuilt Take Boley, Oklahoma. Once the largest Black town in America, founded by freedmen in Creek Nation. Even after decades of pressure, Boley still stands today. A whisper of what was once a thunderclap, but proof that the fire never finished the job. Or take the Seminole freedmen, who fought for decades in court to have their citizenship recognized again after being stripped in the 20th century. In 2021, they won. The Seminole Nation was forced to acknowledge them once more. That victory echoes the same defiance their ancestors showed in the swamps centuries ago. And here's where the story sharpens into something America doesn't want to talk about. When Black Indians gained land through treaties, the U.S. government found a new scheme, the allotment system. Divide up communal land, hand it out in individual parcels, then trick or pressure Black families into selling it cheap. Oil companies swooped in, white settlers swooped in. Entire fortunes slipped away under the cover of legal sales. The wealth stolen from Black Indians didn't always come with bombs and fire. Sometimes it came with contracts and handshakes, the most American theft of all. But even then, families fought back. Some refused to sell. Some passed land down in secret wills. Some moved into towns like Tulsa and built businesses instead. Every story carries the same rhythm: stripped, rebuilt, stripped, rebuilt. A cycle of survival that proves resilience. Is it in the bloodline? Now ask yourself this: If the freedmen had been left alone to keep their land, their towns, their wealth, where would Black America be today? How much generational wealth would have been passed down? How many skyscrapers, corporations, or universities could have been founded by the children of Black Indians? That question alone reveals why the story is hidden, because it shows, in black and white, that poverty was manufactured, not natural. The system had to destroy prosperity again and again to keep control. And it's not just about land or money, it's about identity. By erasing freedmen from tribal roles, America forced generations into a false choice. You're either black or native, but never both. That division cut deep, families split, heritage denied. And yet, the truth always slipped through. Oral stories passed down at kitchen tables. Dark-skinned grandmothers who whispered, "We were Cherokee." Great-grandfathers who said, "We came from Creek blood." The government could burn papers, but it couldn't burn memory. That's why today, thousands of freedmen descendants are reclaiming their heritage, demanding tribal recognition, digging through archives to prove what they already know in their bones. And every victory they win is another crack in the lie America told. Because the truth is simple. Black Indians weren't rare. They weren't accidents. They were everywhere. In the swamps of Florida, in the plains of Oklahoma, in the streets of Tulsa, in the ashes of Rosewood. They were warriors, landowners, teachers, business leaders. They were erased not because they didn't exist, but because they were too powerful when they did. And if you think the story ends with burned towns and stolen land, you're wrong. Because the bloodline kept pushing forward, through Jim Crow, through redlining, through the civil rights movement. Black Indians carried their dual heritage like a secret weapon, a reminder that they weren't just survivors of slavery, but descendants of nations. That's the power they tried to bury. That's the legacy still breathing under the surface. And if you want to see how deep that legacy runs, you have to follow it into the wars Black Indians fought. Not just with guns and swords, but in courts, in schools, in every place where America tried to erase them. Because when you trace the line from the swamps of Florida to the burning streets of Tulsa, one truth becomes clear. Black Indians were always at the heart of America's greatest fear. Asterisk. Wars reveal truths that peace tries to hide. And when you dig into America's wars, the presence of Black Indians is everywhere. Even though history books barely whisper their names. We already touched the Seminole Wars. Those swamp campaigns where escaped Africans and native Seminoles bled the U.S. Army dry. But what you may not realize is just how much those wars haunted America. The Seminole resistance lasted decades, stretching from 1817 into the 1850s, costing millions of dollars and thousands of soldiers' lives. Andrew Jackson built his political career on crushing savages, but the ones who kept slipping through his fingers weren't just Seminoles, they were Black warriors that think about the image America tried to paint, natives as doomed victims, Africans as broken slaves. And yet here was a force that was neither victim nor broken. Here were Black Seminoles using muskets, ambushes, and guerrilla tactics that outsmarted generals. They fought like ghosts, vanish into swamps, strike, vanish again. And every victory they won told enslaved Africans across the South, freedom isn't a dream, it's a choice. Just get to Florida, and you'll find the people who will fight. With you, not against you. That was the real threat. Not just military losses, but inspiration. Black Seminoles were proof that the enslaved could escape, regroup, and come back with firepower. That's why the U.S. poured so much into crushing them. They weren't just fighting an Indian war. They were fighting the possibility of a Black rebellion spreading like wildfire. And yet, even after decades of battles, America never truly defeated the Black Seminoles. Many slipped away to Mexico, where they continued to fight, this time against slave catchers who crossed the border, trying to drag them back. Imagine that. Black warriors chasing down raiders in Mexico, still refusing to bend to America's will. Their descendants in northern Mexico still carry the stories, still sing the songs of their ancestors who fought like shadows against an empire. But the Seminole Wars weren't the end of Black Indian resistance. When the Civil War came, the question of loyalty tore tribes apart. Some Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole leaders sided with the Confederacy. Others leaned Union, and Black Indians? They found themselves in the middle, sometimes enslaved, sometimes free, often forced to pick a side. In a war that wasn't theirs to begin with, yet no matter the side, Black Indians fought. Some in Union regiments, some in Confederate units under Native leaders. In battles across Indian territory, they became the deciding factor. And when the war ended, treaties demanded tribes free their slaves and recognize freedmen as citizens. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, it was just another stage for betrayal. Still, the fact remains, Black Indians shed blood in the Civil War, reshaping the destiny of tribes and of America itself. Their loyalty, their service, their sacrifice, erased when convenient. Remembered only when it served someone else's politics. After the Civil War, when the U.S. pushed west with its manifest destiny, another chapter opened. The Buffalo Soldiers. These black regiments are remembered as some of the toughest fighters in American history. What most people don't know, many of them were Black Indians, men of African and Native heritage, carrying both traditions into the battlefield. The Buffalo Soldiers earned their name from Native tribes who said their hair resembled the buffalo's mane. But the respect went deeper. Natives saw in them a spirit that wouldn't die. Ironically, many Buffalo Soldiers were ordered to fight against Native tribes resisting removal, forcing them into the painful position of being used as a weapon against their own kin. That contradiction, serving the U.S. military while carrying Native blood, is a wound in history that still hasn't healed. Yet, even inside that contradiction, there's power. Buffalo Soldiers proved again and again that black fighters were indispensable. They built forts, guarded settlers, battled bandits, and survived conditions white regiments often couldn't. They fought in Mexico, in the plains, even in the Philippines later on. And each time their blood was spilled, but their names were sidelined. Ask yourself, why does America glorify Custer's last stand, but not the Black and Native men who rode patrols for decades, holding the frontier together? Why do textbooks skip over the battles where Black Indians stood in both uniforms, some in blue Union coats, some in buckskin, some in both? Because their existence shatters the simple story America wants. White heroes, Native victims, Black slaves. Black Indians don't fit that story. They prove we were warriors, strategists, survivors who shaped the outcome of wars that defined this country. Asterisk, and the erasure doesn't stop at the frontier. Look at World War I. Native code talkers became famous later, but before that, Black Indians were already enlisting, fighting overseas, carrying identities the U.S. never wanted to acknowledge. In World War II, Black Indians wore uniforms in segregated units, sometimes denied the right to call themselves Native because of their skin tone, even while fighting under the same flag. The contradiction followed them everywhere. Good enough to die for America,